Welcome to our Google Hangout about the role of men in fighting violence against women. I'm Jeb Sharp. I'm the show producer at Public Radio International's The World, the public radio program. And where shall I start? We have been, ever since the incident in Delhi in December, covering in a pretty intense way what happened in Delhi, the gang rape of a young woman, her subsequent death, but really the outcry that provoked, the discussions about what happened there and what was happening in lots of other places, and just forcing a really, even more than usually, an intense examination of issues of violence against women in different places and how societies are grappling with that. And we did, in February, a Google Hangout with some scholars and activists very much focused on the global movement around these issues, and was it a global movement? And it was striking that we had lined up all women to talk about the issue, and we were sort of rightly and roundly alerted to the fact that we had not included men, and also people on the panel were saying men are absolutely essential to this conversation. So we've gathered several of you today, and I want each of you to introduce yourself and where you're from and how you come to the issue. And we'll just start off like that with about a minute each. And I do want to say, for everybody watching, please join the conversation. Just use the hashtag WorldGender. You tweet your questions and comments, and we will work them into the conversation.
Hello, everyone. I'm really honored to be part of this program. And I'm Ali Shahidi from Kabul, Afghanistan, an independent women's rights activist. All my activism started from my personal experiences. I wasn't part of any organization or any advocacy group, but everything came from very, very personal experiences and from personal transformations from a very violent and tragic childhood to turning into a passionate advocate for women in Afghanistan.
Lovely. We'll come back to you very soon. Richard Tolman.
Yeah. Well, I've been involved in efforts to end men violence.
Tell us who you're with and your affiliation.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I'm at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. I also work with an organization called Mobilizing Men for Violence Prevention, which is a interdisciplinary group of researchers who are trying to study the global movement of men who are involved as allies in the efforts to end violence against women and children. And my own work began in the field about 30 years ago. I've been involved as a practitioner, advocate, researcher, in studying the ways that interventions might help men stop their abusive and violent behavior towards women.
Great. And Sunil Bhatia, please introduce yourself and let us know how you come to the issue.
Yeah, I'm a professor of human development and I teach at Connecticut College. I teach also a class on media, self, and society, specifically looking at the construction of masculinities. I've been very interested in how media constructs South Asian masculinities too, and what is the impact of those masculinity on attitudes towards men, sexuality, and gender. But more recently, I was in Delhi when the incident and the young woman was brutally raped, and I wrote about it in an op-ed in Feminist Wire, and my personal connection to that has to do with this organization I work for, which is called Shelter Associates in Pune, India, where they try to provide sanitation to women in different slums who don't have basic things like toilets. And the reason they need sanitation is because when they get up in the morning and go and defecate, they usually invite sexual assaults, things like rape, and so on. So I've understood the issue far more deeply through my personal experience of actually interviewing women who don't have access to these basic things like sanitation, and what are the consequences for their body as a result of it.
Why don't we actually, since you bring up Delhi and talk about that work, why don't we start with you? It was really striking in the protests around Delhi how many men were on the streets and calling for the same thing the women were. How did that strike you, and what was the role of men immediately after the Delhi incident?
I think the Delhi incident, first of all, has been in the making for a very long time. There have been many, many incidents of rape against women throughout history and across South Asia. I think this moment was I would call a catalytic moment where it gave a face to the woman and to the movement, essentially. And it's not that the men weren't thinking about it as well. The men were thinking about it, but they didn't really have a public space in which they could talk about these issues. Because for a long time, issues of rape, issues of assault are really, really deeply connected with women's issues of honor, issues of purity, issues of sacredness within the Indian community, for example. So there wasn't a public language that men could use to even understand. And they didn't need to because they had the invisible power, essentially. So this episode in Delhi gave men a frame, or a vocabulary to talk about gender rights, because it was in the media, and they were talking about it in their colleges, they were talking about it in different public places. So the leaders, the youth, the women, all came together in this very interesting synergistic movement where this essentially gave expression to where men had a chance to come in and speak about what they were thinking.
Sunil, can you talk about how that's changed the dynamic in India? Has the movement changed? Has anything tangible come of that? How is it playing into the aftermath?
I think the aftermath, one of the most significant results of this, of a significant impact of the rape incident has been that women have expressed their voices and men are listening, but most essentially men in leadership positions. Men in leadership positions, politicians in leadership positions, people in the army, for example. This is on their radar screen. But more importantly, you have seen a significant youth movement. That it's a ground-up movement that is now forming alliances with many other feminist organizations and saying that count us in too. We have brothers, we have sisters, we have mothers who experienced this, we know, we have witnessed it. Now, Michael Kimmel, a sociologist, talks about this three very important categories that exist in men's culture. One is culture of silence, one is culture of protection, one is culture of privilege. What I found is that men are willing to now break this culture of silence and publicly admit that they are part of the patriarchy. And I would say that the numbers are still very small. I can't really go ahead and say that somehow this is a movement yet. But it's simmering. There are discussions in the public spaces, in coffee shops, in classrooms, in colleges, and it has mobilized men and women to come together for the first time and talk about men's complicity, which is difficult because there's not been a history for men to talk about it publicly.
We can move to Ali. Do you see a similar sort of movement happening in Afghanistan? Are more men paying attention to these issues? Are more men in power paying attention to the issues around safety for women?
Well, very unfortunately, the violence against women in Afghanistan has increased a lot, and very recently specifically. While on the other hand, the more the violence increased against women in Afghanistan, we haven't seen significant movements that could stand against this, or against the violence, or mobilize movements against violence against women, and which is very unfortunate. But the good thing is that the social media that mostly constitute whose audience mostly consists of youth and youth generation are growing. The awareness is being raised, and people are getting involved into issues of women's rights and activism.
I was really struck with what Sunil was saying, and Ali, you may have said this, I apologize, just how does that strike you? Because I imagine it doesn't feel like that in Kabul.
Oh no, no, it was different. It's different in Afghanistan. I told you that unfortunately the violence against women is an increase, but the movement is very slow, especially men. We don't see men's involvement in fighting for women's rights or in advocating for women's rights. The thing is happening in Delhi is really promising. The people are aware, women are aware of their rights, and men are going to respect women's rights in Delhi. But unfortunately, it's completely opposite in Afghanistan, or at least the movement is very, very slow in Afghanistan. The only change we can see is on the social media, on Facebook and Twitter. When we see the young people, the youth generation, they get involved into advocacy groups through social media, and they get involved into issues, the updates or the news on women's plight, and how to remove the violent behaviors, or how to start respecting women's rights. So the only movement, the only promising movement we can see is just on the social media that can involve the higher number of men.
Richard, as you listen to these two, talking about these two places and your own knowledge of global movements, what strikes you, and what are you seeing elsewhere?
Yeah, well, first I just want to say, you know, speaking...
I should say, hashtag WorldGender for those watching. Questions, comments. Sorry, Richard.
Thanks. Well, I just first wanted to say that from the perspective of somebody working in the United States, I just want to say how valuable and inspiring it's been to see the examples of men doing this work in areas where it might not be as expected, or where the prevailing barriers and resistance to men's involvement are so strong and sometimes even so dangerous. So I remember an inspiring example from our early days of delving into what was happening globally was an organization of men in Rwanda that were working very actively against gender violence just after the extreme political violence and genocide that was occurring there. And so when you see men facing off against the kinds of resistance and other kinds of structural problems that are occurring, and making room for and committing themselves to working against gender violence, I just think that that's a very inspiring example, and something that we're hoping to, through our research, learn from these kind of global and international examples of
that case. That case study in Rwanda, what prompted it? Why was there?
It wasn't a case study. Yeah, we began to just try to catalog the organizations around the globe that were doing some work, and that's something that really hasn't been done. There is a growing global movement. I mean, there's active organizations trying to involve NGOs and organizations around the world into kind of at least some kind of networking, regional and international networking, so that they can synergize and learn and network to promote this work in global ways. And so we just started out wanting to answer the question maybe that you're asking too, is what is happening around the globe? What are men doing? What impact does it have? So we've been just beginning to do that, and part of that was just cataloging and looking for examples of things that are happening.
How is the work of men different on this issue? If we say specifically something as horrific as what happened in India, and kind of a concerted effort to combat that kind of violence in public places, is there a different approach, offering, tactic, sensibility? What happens when men enter the conversation or the advocacy?
Yeah, well, again, for better or for worse, men have a lot of power to talk to other men, and what Sunil was mentioning about the various cultures that men engage in, there's very often cultures of collusion and silence, where men support each other's violence or entitlement to power over women by the ways that they stay silent or way they actively collude with each other. And so men need to be part of the solution and be actively engaged in breaking that silence and in working against men's collusion with those kinds of activities. So I think men bring that unique ability to speak to other men in powerful ways that they may not be reached by women.